right, Colin, how's it going today?
That's good. This is a little bit different though. I feel like maybe I'm in the
Yeah.
hot seat today.
That's right. We've got a bonus episode today that I think we'll post to our Wannabe Angels podcast and also the Rideshare Guy podcast because we're doing a mix, a special episode talking to you about your experience at Outdoorsy and building that marketplace and sort of how it relates to rideshare and Uber and Lyft and everything like that. Sound good?
Sounds like a great plan to me. Let's do it.
All right. Cool. Well, I'm going to read your bio now. So, Colin Gardiner is a startup and tech entrepreneur who thinks about everything through an economic lens. He's an expert in digital marketplaces and platforms with a love for all things growth, monetization, analytics, and strategy. He has worked as an early employee at Outdoorsy, Roamly, Tripping.com, Just Answer, and Ancestry.com. Within these companies, he has played critical executive roles, helping raise over $200 million and taken multiple to over $1 billion in gross revenue. He currently runs a marketplace and startup advisory business, helping founders grow and optimize their businesses. He also runs Yonder.vc, which is a syndicate focused on funding pre-seed, seed, and Series A marketplace startups. And last but not least, he's also my co-host for our new podcast, Wannabe Angels, which, we'll obviously spend some time, a couple minutes talking about at the end. Sound good? How are you, Colin?
I'm good. I think I need to update my bio probably to hit that wannabe angels right at the first thing there, right? Probably the most important thing about me there.
I don't know about first thing, maybe the last thing. I kind of ad-libbed it and added it for you, but we won't bore the audience with our lack of knowledge of angel investing for now. For now, let's talk about something that you actually know well. So what is Outdoorsy, for those who may not know?
Yeah, so Outdoorsy, the most recent marketplace I worked at, but Outdoorsy is, very much like Airbnb for RVs, right? You can go there if you have an RV, list it for rent, and then someone can come in and rent it from you. Uh, That's the whole premise on it. It's in some sense Airbnb on wheels, right? And it's a nice mix between like
Mhm.
rideshare and home sharing. So it's got a little bit of facets of both of those.
Yeah, it's sort of like Uber meets Airbnb. How did you guys describe Outdoorsy most commonly? Airbnb and wheels, is that what you said?
No, I don't think that wasn't like quite the tagline, but the yeah, we really more towards the Airbnb element. They do, people do drive them around, right? More often than not, they're
Yeah.
stationary. So people rent them, take them to a
Mm.
campground, park them in their driveway, find a plot of land. So they're really more of like the accommodation part. They just happen to be on wheels as well. But there are two types, right? So one is
Gotcha.
your motorized vehicle, like you drive it literally with the steering
Mhm.
wheel. The big Class A's or whatever the Winnebagos on the road. And then there's the trailers that, ones that you tow behind, and those don't actually drive. So just
Mm.
different assets on the same platform, but,
Got it.
very different behavior.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point for those who may not be RV experts. So an RV, what does that stand for? Recreational vehicle?
You got it. You nailed it.
And so an RV, that could be one like a Winnebago that you drive and that's where people sleep. Are there and there's multiple types of RVs, or is a trailer a type of RV?
Yeah. So there's essentially motorized and towable. Those are the two types of RVs. So like a camper van would be in the motorized segment, or like the giant ones that you see going down the
Hmm.
road. That's considered motorized.
Yeah.
And then a trailer would be like an Airstream. That would be considered a trailer.
Hmm.
And those you tow behind
But are
a
the
truck or
motorized
a
ones, are
SUV.
they RVs? Is that what you would call
They're
them?
both
RVs,
RVs.
and then are trailers also RVs? Okay, trailers are
Yeah.
also RVs.
Mhm.
Got it. Okay, cool. Just wanted to get my terminology out of the way. So, yeah, so I mean, I think I like the way of describing it. It's kind of like, it really is, it's less Uber, kind of driving people around and more renting, an Airbnb that happens to be on wheels, right? But obviously that vehicle component, is pretty important because, you have to worry about like vehicle expenses and things like that. So are there a lot of talk about the marketplace for a little bit. Are there a lot of individual owners on Outdoorsy that are renting their vehicles to customers?
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting about it. I'd say it's probably more similar to Turo and Airbnb mix
Hmm.
than it
Yeah,
is probably Uber, because there's no driver that comes with it typically. But yeah,
yeah.
so it's a lot of individuals in the United States own RVs. I think it's roughly 1 in 6, 1 in 7 households owns an RV in the United States. So it's massive.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of those, sit between the coasts, not just, that's where they are. And so, yeah, a lot of individuals, they'll have a loan on their vehicle and they don't want to be underwater on it anymore. So they'll start renting it out, because most people have 2 weeks of vacation. They use it maybe two
Hmm.
weeks out of the year. And then the rest of the time, sit and fallow. And so that's the value prop, is
Yeah.
you put it on the platform, other people take it out, rent it. You can pay your mortgage, you can do whatever you want on it. And so that's the concept. But there are also professionals, similar to like Uber, there are like people that rent out like fleets of cars to drivers and things like that. There's a very similar
Mhm.
concept in Outdoorsy as well. The pros.
Yeah, got it. And yeah, because I feel like a lot of times marketplaces, right, like Uber and, even Airbnb for sure, right, kind of starts, the initial idea is kind of pitched as like, hey, you've got this RV, it sits there, for a few or most 50 out of 52 weeks and, rent it in your downtime. And then you start doing it and it's kind of good here and there, but like it seems like a majority of the volume ends up happening, like Uber, right, 10 to 20 or sorry 20% of drivers are full-time 40 50 hours a week or more, and they make up 50 to 60% of the rides on the platform. Airbnb, it's like every time you rent an Airbnb you see they've got like multiple listings, and I'm no fan of Airbnb to be honest, but it's like kind of more power owners, renters. Is that sort of what Outdoorsy has gravitated towards also?
Yeah, I mean, I think marketplace principle wise, marketplaces professionalize over time. And so that's just like
Hmm.
a core principle of it is that, people aggregate on the supply side, deliver a more standardized experience and higher quality experience, like, more hotel like in
Yeah.
some sense, right? And so pretty common that like across
Yeah.
all peer-to-peer marketplaces, they return to the power sellers largely.
Hmm. Yeah, well, actually, that's a good point. I've never heard of that term professionalize over time, but that definitely is a good way to put it. And I feel like it kind of goes against, though, what a lot of these companies, I mean, I guess we'll talk marketplaces for a second since you're the marketplace expert. I mean, it kind of goes against what a lot of these companies initially pitch, right? Like, let's throw Uber under the bus for a second, right? Like, they're like, hey, this is part time, come do it and earn a few bucks. They're not like advertising, hey, come work 50 hours a week, bust your ass off, and make $25, $20 an hour as full time, but we don't have to pay you like a full time employee, right? Even though that ends up kind of like what you said, professionalizing. So how do you think about that kind of transition for marketplaces? Is it just sort of inevitable and ultimate, and you should kind of keep? Do you think it's sort of like, I guess what's the word? Do you think it's kind of like a pretense that everyone just sort of knows what it's actually like but doesn't admit it, or do you think I'm wrong?
I mean, I think there's always an element of the marketing side selling the dream, right? And then in reality, what
Hmm.
happens is there are people that can actually deliver, right? And those are the people that professionalize. So I think that's the core concept to me is that, you're going to have high churn on your supply side. Like it's just, and it's not a bad thing. It's just
Hmm.
a good thing. You're going to churn into the good supply,
Yeah.
which is the people that can provide liquidity, right? Like, and those people are the people that work crazy hours and do all the rides and everything, and they make the money, right? And it's the same thing on Airbnb, everyone
Yeah.
else. It's this whoever can do it and provide the liquidity is going to win. But in reality, they still need to keep the top of the funnel going. So the marketing side of it is going to have to speak to that dream, that
Mhm.
vision of, part time or whatever gets people enticed to come sign up.
Gotcha. So, one
Yeah.
of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you about Outdoorsy, because I really like these sort of studying adjacent verticals. Like, I don't know anything about RVs clearly, but, it's a vehicle marketplace on wheels, right? And, sort of like we talked about. So, I mean, what are some things that you sort of learn about marketplaces, from your time at Outdoorsy that might apply to other, probably related marketplaces like Uber and Lyft being a good one, or other vehicle marketplaces, maybe car sharing, sort of like these adjacent marketplaces? What's something that you think you picked up that, maybe others didn't pick up on in your experience?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that we really focused on, or at least was a really key part of getting the marketplace going, was insurance.
Hmm.
Just by virtue of vehicles being on the road and like the law, you have to have liability insurance. And so that was this really got drilled into my head that a lot of marketplaces have this concept of what creates liquidity for the marketplace, like what has to be true for someone to be
Hmm.
able to use it, right? And insurance in the RV space and the car sharing space generally just had to happen. Like you had to either bring your own liability insurance or you had to provide it in the process. And that I think that was the kind of lesson I learned for a lot of marketplaces is there's these like liquidity services that if you don't have them will really constrain you longer term. Like and that you should embrace trying to get those things, whether they're regulated or unregulated, financing, whatever it may be, embracing those early and trying to work with those people like that was something that I learned really heavily. And we did look back quite a bit on the Uber, Lyft, Airbnb experience where, they grew fast, but they kind of didn't listen to the regulators. They didn't take them, acknowledge them up front. It was just kind of like, they'll adapt to us.
Hmm.
And I think that was something we did a little bit differently. I played nicely there and tried to work with the system to get a better outcome more quickly. And I think that, like, I don't know, that was something I learned and I think is a smart way to go. But also that most marketplaces need to think through really hard is like, it isn't just sufficient to bring buyers and sellers online, right? Like you need to be
Yeah.
able to make sure that you can make the transaction happen and what needs to be true to do that. And in the case of vehicle marketplaces, insurance, and insurance is huge for Uber and Lyft as well, right? Overall, that was something
Yeah.
I learned from watching them, honestly, how to do it different.
Interesting that you mentioned insurance. It's probably the number one topic whenever I meet a new rideshare startup or a new fleet. And, whether I'm doing a consulting call with them or whatever. And like, whenever I ask them what's like their main focus or what's their challenge, or what do they need help with, it's always insurance. And I actually have a great partner in the insurance space. I've had on my podcast a couple times, Ed Walker from Hub, and yeah, he's great. And honestly, I most of the time just like send them to him and don't have to do anything when it comes to insurance. So tell me more, like what, when you're at Outdoorsy, what was the specific insurance issues that you guys had to deal with or navigate? I imagine that if I'm an owner, I've got personal insurance on my RV, and now I'm listing it on this marketplace, which is technically for hire, which I'm guessing, personal insurance doesn't like, right? Or is technically,
Mhm.
now if it gets into an accident, my personal insurance isn't going to cover it because I was doing for hire, right? So either Outdoorsy would have to cover that, or no one would cover it, and I'd be screwed as a renter, as a owner, right?
Yeah, you nailed it, right? Like personal insurance is not commercial insurance, right? And it says you shouldn't use the asset that you're insuring for business uses, right? And so that was the thing that
Yep.
we identified pretty quickly. It was like, well, if we want the supply side to come on and, a high quantity, and really this is like an
Hmm.
infinity kind of asset, you need to provide them a solution that protects the asset. And know that, and that isn't sufficient though, because you do protect it during the rental period, but technically you are still using it for commercial purposes. And so your insurance could drop you. So Roamly, one of the companies you mentioned in my bio, is a company that we spun out of Outdoorsy that basically built an insurance product for people that own RVs that allowed them to rent. So it was like a replacement for their personal insurance,
Hmm.
that allowed them to have personal
What was that
coverage and
company?
rent. Roamly, Roamly. And I think this gets back to like what we learned about playing nicely, right, in the space and trying to innovate is that if you can work with insurance companies and you can bring it to them as like an option and a solution and have data behind it and not force them into it, you can have really good outcomes. Because today,
Hmm.
Uber and Lyft don't own their own insurance company, right? They still go to everybody else to underwrite it, right? And I
Yeah.
think that is an interesting like historical change that could have happened if they had
Hmm.
been thinking a little bit differently rather than just straight up disruption, which is awesome in certain ways and beautiful to see, but also has outcomes that are not so good.
Got it. Yeah, no, there's definitely, I would say there actually hasn't been enough talk about the fact that, Uber is spending $4 billion a year on insurance, and all of the major carriers are kind of, dropping them left and right. And like insurance is like this huge issue. I just recorded a bunch of videos for like our top 7 articles on the website that are probably going to get viewed by millions of people. And the gist was basically like, as a driver, whether you're doing rideshare or food delivery, you're incentivized to drive as fast and as crazy as possible. I mean, if you've got a passenger in the car, you have to kind of within reason, but especially on delivery, right? You're trying to go from one point to the next as quickly as possible because you get paid. If you do more jobs per hour, you get paid more, right? So not only are they, like kind of, not rewarding drivers, but they're literally like doing the opposite, right? Which usually you want to reward drivers for safe driving, safe behavior, right? On the insurance side, but they're literally doing the opposite and kind of wondering why we're spending billions of dollars, why they're spending billions of dollars on insurance costs. Kind of funny. Not funny, but yeah, a little funny.
Yeah, I mean, platform incentivization is like super important to the loss runs on the back end, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
think caring about the insurance outcome, right, and ultimately about your supply side, right, like their safety, all these things can lead to lower insurance costs, right? And that ultimately leads to lower premiums, which means
Yeah.
to lower pricing to the demand side. Like there's a virtuous cycle here of playing, like actually optimizing for this. And, I know that some of that happens, right? Because there's a lot of overlap in people that underwrite insurance in the sharing economy. But like, I think that was something that Outdoorsy did really well, was a big focus. And, I think overall it's just something I've learned working in startups is like, how do you kind of weaponize your cost centers and turn them into profit centers for you? Like, I think that's like a really interesting
Hmm.
area of opportunity is that, if you can make insurance a profit center rather than a, cost center, you then focus on it and it becomes a core advantage and a key part of your business that differentiates you. So I think like with all these things, there's just really interesting ways to do it if you care about it and you make it a core focus. But if your core ethos, is just speed, 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 and volume, that's going to have, consequences
Yeah.
in other places.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is I don't know if it's famous, but I feel like that is a tried and true business principle, right? I don't know if it was Amazon or whoever, first coined the term or the sort of saying, right, to turn your cost centers into businesses or opportunities, right? I don't know if it was Amazon, but I'm assuming, AWS or shipping or whatever. It was like stuff we're spending a ton of money on. Let's just do it ourselves and do it better. Was there anything else? I mean, insurance is a good one, to be honest, because I imagine it's like up there in the top two or three costs that you guys had at Outdoorsy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think for like most vehicle sharing marketplaces or rideshare sharing, like insurance is just one of the biggest costs overall, right? I think the other big thing I've
Hmm.
learned about marketplaces, having built a couple, and specifically around Outdoorsy, is that it's vitally important to have this like organically driven business, right? Like if you spend all your
Hmm.
time like going out and paying for customers and acquiring them, it's going to be very hard to be successful over time. And so whatever you can do to get, yourself up to 60, 80% of your traffic coming organically, direct or word of mouth, like, the more successful
Hmm.
you're going to be. And so I think that's always something that like Uber did well, right? Is like they were top of mind. They were like rolled off the tongue for when you wanted to do this. As I think about it, and the same for
Yeah.
Airbnb. Like you look at these classic marketplaces, like people talked about them. They became a verb in of themselves, right? I'm gonna go Uber, I'm
Yeah.
gonna go Airbnb, something like. And so it taught me how important branding is in all of this. And it's like it doesn't matter at the small
Hmm.
stage, and then it really matters later. And so anyway, that's a big lesson for me is that just branding overall can create these really awesome outcomes, but they take a lot of time and energy
Yeah.
to build.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the nice things, I guess, for a company like Uber is that it was sort of high frequency, right? You might take
Hmm.
one or two rides a week or a few over a weekend. With something like Airbnb or Outdoorsy, if you're only renting an RV once or twice a week, what did you sort of do to, kind of spread the word and stay top of mind?
Yeah. Well, so before I tell you about Outdoorsy, I think one of the really interesting things that I learned just watching the scooter and the rideshare space is they provided like native advertising. Like scooters having like lime or bird
Hmm.
written on it and the setting on a street corner was basically free billboard advertising.
Mm.
Like these native marketing channels are just
Yeah.
brilliant, right? And then the mustache and Lyft, the
Yeah.
Uber with their light up sticker, like that's just free advertising, right? It's like high leverage. And so I always stress with like
Yeah.
marketplaces and when I'm talking to them is like, how do you come up with this native marketing channel? Like what is that? Like how do you leverage
Mm.
that? How do you get your supply to market for you in some way? Like I don't know if you're familiar with Whatnot. They're like a QVC type marketplace, but it's essentially the supply side can go live video
Mm.
and sell their product, right? So they
Mm.
just do like live video streams and they sell whatever they're selling. And so they have a ton of different verticals,
Yeah.
competing directly with eBay and things like that. And so that was one of the things I learned is like, how do you build like native marketing channels and like really leverage those because they're super awesome. And, in like a lot of ways, like for Outdoorsy, like that
Yeah.
came through in referral, things like that.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I actually like that term native marketing. And it kind of reminds me of the fact that, a lot of these companies, almost all of these companies would never give out swag or anything kind of simple to their rideshare or delivery drivers. Like Lyft would give you a jacket that you would have to do 1,000 trips or something, kind of like a high
Oh man.
threshold, right? And it would have been like great free marketing, right? If like every Postmates or Uber Eats driver is, walking around with, the brand on their shirt. And, a lot of these guys like want it. Like sometimes you're making a delivery and it like looks a little shady if you're like going up to someone's house and, you're just like, dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, right? So there's also like practical purposes why some of this is useful. But then for the kind of branding and marketing, and then of course, people might wear it around town, right? And, kind of want to rep. Someone sees you wearing it and they say, hey, do you work for Uber Eats or, have you delivered for them? And, it kind of just adds to that. I feel like a lot of the kind of gig companies, I don't know, some of them are doing it now, but I think that native marketing channel has been overlooked.
Yeah, one thing I got the other day that I was like, this company is brilliant. I think it was Sweet Greens. We got Uber Eats delivered, Sweet
Mhm.
Green salad, and then in there was a coupon thing to go direct to them, right? Like a discount, like oh, go to the Sweet
Yeah.
Greens app. And I was like, this is a perfect example of like leveraging like the channel or whatever it is to like drive your marketing.
Yeah.
And there is that moment between when they like you see your driver pull up with your food and they come to your door and there really is no branding there like in a lot of ways I think there's opportunity too to like really like do more there, but it is hard when you have a essentially I think probably a lot of the
Yeah.
reason they want to give them uniforms in some sense is they didn't want to make them seem like they worked for them or things like that. So there's that problem too.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I'm sure there's a fine line you can walk where you don't need to require them to wear shirts, but like a lot of these guys and gals like wanted it or wanted to, or maybe you have a store where they can buy it, or just kind of make that easier. I mean, the companies do it, right? It's like they give out swag. So I know it's definitely legal. Maybe there's some gray area or fine line, but I think if, you're getting paid a lot of money and you have a fancy MBA, I'm sure you could figure this one out.
Totally.
So, I want to go back to something you said about marketplaces profession on the supply side, drivers and hosts and owners professionalizing over time. What are some principles you learned? Like what makes like a really good professional, someone who's really good at renting, on Outdoorsy, for example? Like what are some of those principles that you learned that might apply to other marketplaces, other people doing other jobs in other marketplaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall the outcome is always like 5-star review, right? That's like the canonical scoring, right?
Yeah.
And so whatever happens to need to make that happen.
Hmm.
But I think, I kind of think about this a lot in like the from a hotel perspective. Like what makes a great hotel, right? It's
Yeah.
consistent service that hits on all the points and like they're friendly, they're nice, they remember you, they personalize all of these things, right? Like that make you feel like
Yeah.
really good inside. And so I think that's what comes back to like all of these things. These are all service businesses at the end of the day, right? Like yes, there's an asset underlying it, but there's a service element because it's people. And like I think Uber is a good example. It's like a
Hmm.
one-to-one drive every time. And like, yeah, I don't necessarily want to talk to my Uber driver, but you do want to feel like it was a good experience, and that is like it's a clean car. They greeted you friendly. They helped you maybe with your bag or something. Like like it's a good service.
Yeah.
And end of the day, like that's what it is. So
What is the number one thing that led to a 5-star review for a host on Outdoorsy? Or what's the
hmm.
one thing that led to a negative review? Also, kind of conversely.
I think the thing that always got people was like this whole like nitpicking over like the cleaning side of it or adding additional fees for like cleaning. Like like people that really like nitpicked all of those things was like you had a great trip
Hmm.
and then you came back and they said X, Y, and Z things were wrong. And it's like, I just, like that was not what I wanted to do. It's not like the
Hmm.
hotel calls you and says, yeah, you didn't, this room's a mess. And that's the thing. That was always the thing for me that I always felt like set it up poorly. Even for like an Airbnb, like leaves you a bad review. Like they didn't take out the trash and you're like, man, like we paid
But I
enough.
mean,
Like we even
typically
paid extra for towels.
you can't leave a review. You can't leave a review until they've also left a review, right? So if, the host charges you for extra cleaning and fees and all that, you can't then go and like leave them a bad review because they
True.
did that. What was like the thing that,
Mm,
hosts would be like, oh, or a customer would say, hey, I'm leaving a bad review because of this. Like, what was the most common thing for
cleanliness.
Outdoorsy
Yeah,
customers to leave a negative review for? Like the
cleanliness for
RV
sure.
wasn't clean enough when I got it, basically. Hmm.
Yeah, they didn't meet my
And you think that's
requirements
because
for
maybe it
everything.
was like such a big vehicle or?
I mean, I think there's like, it's unique about RVs is one, there's like the dump tanks, which is like not super fun to talk about, and there's a toilet
Hmm.
on it. So there's emptying the dump tanks, there's like filling up the gas, the water, all these things, and then like the inside cleanliness of it. And so those are all the things that, at
Hmm.
least on the supply side, would be
Interesting.
like they would complain about, right? Because they're like all the things they have to solve to turn over for the next trip. And then on the demand side, right, they don't want to get
Hmm.
an RV that falls apart, has broken pieces. These things aren't
Yeah.
built the best, like that, just like a fact of the matter. And so they
Yeah.
do have problems. And then if they're not clean, like it's like if you showed up at an Airbnb or hotel and it wasn't clean, you'd be like, this is awful. Or the beds suck, there's no pillows, things like that.
Got it. Because I think the thing I've seen and sort of what we tell Uber drivers is the number one thing that actually leads to negative reviews is bad navigation. Basically, like not getting
Huh.
people where they want to go in a kind of quick and efficient manner. So it's sort of funny. And if you think about it, you're like, wow, if I get into a car that looks like a total piece of shit, but the driver's great and he gets me there and he's friendly, like I probably would prefer that than like a really clean car where the driver takes me 10 minutes out of the way and makes wrong turns and is driving unsafe, maybe, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm gonna die. But I'm in a clean car. You know what I mean?
Uh,
So it's sort of
yeah,
interesting. I think that component, right? Because you're trying to get somewhere, right, makes that a little more meaningful versus with an RV, right? It's less about the destination and someone driving you and more about the experience, right?
totally. Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I want to get. I mean, I want to be somewhere on time, but I don't necessarily want to get there faster. I don't know. I feel like there's a distinction there.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe not faster, but on time.
Yeah.
But I do think like speed and efficiency in basically, people transportation marketplaces is the
Yeah.
most important to folks, right? Like Uber Pool and Uber Shared is a good example, right? Like everyone wants, everyone's like, oh yeah, I love taking shared rides, it's cheaper. And then when you get in the car and as a driver, and when they match with another rider, they're like, oh, do you have to pick them up? I'm like, dude, you called an Uber Share, of course I gotta pick them up, you know what I mean? So it's like people
Yeah.
love the idea of paying less for a ride, but then when they actually have to sacrifice time, to get to their destination, they're like, this sucks. Oh, we made a right turn. Oh, we're turning around. Like, oh gosh, get me out of here, right?
Yeah. That makes. I think shared destination works really well, but otherwise, like you said, like yeah, I would just pay for the individual one at that point.
Yeah. Okay. So, I one question specifically I wanted to ask you about marketplaces and rideshare gig economy is I get a lot of drivers and people reaching out to me that want to start a new rideshare company. I still get a lot of
Yeah.
people pitching me on this. I actually have an embargo in my inbox right now. A new company is launching in 8 days, and they just send me a bunch of details, and so I need to review that. But what are your thoughts? You think this is a good idea, a bad idea? You think there's still, now we're 10 years into this, Uber and Lyft are the big players. Do you think there's still room for example, like a new rideshare company, or is it too late?
Yeah. I get this question a lot from investors, and the framework that I think about this is there's like two types of marketplaces. There's a vertical marketplace, so like in an industry or a specific vertical, or horizontal, right? And Uber and Lyft are
Hmm.
largely horizontal at this point marketplaces across many different types. And so when you see something new come out, you have to ask, is this a vertical that Uber or Lyft horizontally hits today? F no, insufficiently
Hmm.
large, potential opportunity. F, they already cover it today. What is the 10x better product experience they're going to deliver? Because if they're not, like, I don't know how they're going to compete, right? Because there's like huge economies of scale now for both these companies. There's probably never going to be that amount of capital allocated to that industry again to make it work, right? And I think that ship has sailed. And so any company trying to get into that is going to be probably relatively underfunded and not be able to compete unless they're just driving some so much better product experience that
Hmm.
it's like you have to use it. And I don't know, I just haven't seen that personally. So I would say net new
So
vertical with
explain
GMV,
to me what,
great.
yeah. So explain to me real quick, what does horizontal versus vertical mean in this context?
Yeah, so like horizontal marketplaces are across like many categories. So like take eBay, right? They
Hmm.
go across all kinds of, baseball cards, cars, like they do everything, right? They're
Gotcha.
horizontal in nature. Whereas there are marketplaces that do very specific things, like Etsy is more horizontal, but they do like handmade goods, right? Like that's their vertical. That's what they
Hmm.
go after. And now there's many specific marketplaces that are going like after sneakers, StockX, ones that are going after trading cards, things like that. They're
Hmm.
slicing off and cleaving off
Gotcha.
huge verticals, but those have to be 10x better
Mm.
experiences, right? They have to be better. They create unique
Got
liquidity, unique supply, better experience. They got to do something different to really work.
Gotcha.
So,
So you're saying
yeah.
Uber and Lyft are sort of horizontal and that they have all these different product offerings, and you can get a food delivered, you can get rides, you can schedule a ride, you can rent a car, all of that. They have all these different options.
Yep. And I think within that, the question I think you and I both have looked at some together, like very industry specific, like either delivery service or some kind of usage of like fallow cars, right? And assets to like move things around.
Hmm.
And the question is like, can DoorDash or Uber or someone already have like a generic solution that they expand into this? Like do they have like do they have the flexibility to do that?
Yeah.
And that's the question. I think that's the bet you're making in those spaces is that they're not going there or their generalized solution won't be able to solve it because it's too complicated.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess too, if you kind of slice off one of these verticals and it's too specific, it might be, too small, or, maybe it's small and like a nice small mom and pop type business, but maybe it's not, if you're looking for a venture backed huge return or exit, maybe it's not quite big enough.
Exactly. I think that nails it. It's like if you're going down the venture route, you just got to be careful that there's like sufficient GMV to produce gross profit over time to make it worthwhile, right? Like Like that's the key. So either you make a new
And how do you
market
figure that
or
out?
you. So the hardest part in all of this is understanding if you're going to make a new market or not, right? Like does your solution open up a market that
Mhm.
didn't exist before? And like Uber is a classic example, right? The taxi market, super small when they looked at it, right? It was big, but relatively small compared to what rideshare is today, right? And so that's what 10x better
Mhm.
experiences do, right? They unlock opportunity, but they also unlock fallow assets, right? And like supply. And by fallow, I mean things that weren't being used, right? Like people had cars that had a bunch of downtime. Now you can have a
Yeah.
driver with their car go and use it, and so you unlock this huge amount of like latent supply, which then could in turn solve for the demand that people want to move around in a more cheap fashion in urban areas. So that's kind of like
Yeah.
how I would like think about it is like, is there opportunity to unlock a net new stair step function into a bigger market? And if not, then
Yeah.
probably not interesting.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I'm sure we could talk marketplaces and me bag on Uber for and other companies and ideas for much longer. But I think this was a great little intro, and appreciate you sharing everything about Outdoorsy. I feel like I should hire you. If I have like a business, I'm like, I know you're a startup advisor. It's like, wow, I'm sold. All right, if I was going to be crazy and start a new company, you're the guy to talk to on all things vehicles, marketplaces. If folks want to learn more about what you're up to, where can they go? Where can they find more about what you're working on and the services you offer?
Yeah, totally. So I'm on all the social channels, LinkedIn, Twitter at Colin Gardiner. But I also run cartalabs.com, which is my advising consulting business. And then my writing on marketplaces is at gardnercolin.com. So those are the best places to go to learn more and see what I'm writing and talking about.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I feel like we should almost just like transition into our next episode of Wannabe Angels right now, but I don't think we have a guest lined up. So for those who haven't listened to Wannabe Angels yet, I'll let you tease it, but that's our new podcast that we've been doing for a while. How do you describe it when people ask you?
I always tell people like, Harry and I were out beating our heads trying to be angel investors, and there was just really no good materials, and it was just us talking to people. And the great people we found, we were like, these people are awesome. And there was no one sharing that. And so that was like what got us into it
Yeah.
was, hey, A, we want to learn from great people. B, we want to share those people with other people because we think they want to listen to them. And it turns out they do, which is awesome. That's how I describe it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. No, it's been pretty fun doing the podcast with you so far. And I think someone asked me the other day, "Oh, how's your podcast with Colin, Wannabe Angels going?" And I said, "Good. We've been doing, I think we're up to 25 episodes now. And I mean, I guess if we do one a week, that's almost 6 months of episodes. But I think we must have queued a bunch up at the beginning because I feel like we haven't been doing it for 6 months, but we basically have released 6 months of episodes."
Yeah. I think we were a little like precocious at the beginning. We really wanted to talk to people. So now we're caught up to that and doing it a little bit more measured,
Well,
but
time
I know,
flies. So I
yeah,
guess if people want to hear Colin and I jam on startups and talk to investors every single week, they've got a good outlet for that, wannabeangels.com. And it's on the podcast is available on all the major platforms and YouTube also. So Colin, appreciate you coming on. And I guess I'll talk to you tomorrow on Wannabe Angels.
no, thank you for having me and see you tomorrow.
All right.